This is Denise Joyner, and welcome to today's Oil for the Journey, Oil Change. And this is relating to the text of Isaiah chapters 28 through 30 that was read earlier. So a couple of things, just so you have a foundation. The book of Isaiah is said to be written around the 8th century BC, and it's a compilation of his various writings to the children of Israel, the nation of Israel. Now remember, the setting has taken place after the separation of Israel into a northern and a southern kingdom. The northern kingdom composed of about 10 tribes, and the southern kingdom, the 2 tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The northern kingdom primarily ruled or centered in Samaria, and the southern kingdom primarily centered in Jerusalem. Here in the text that we read earlier, actually all throughout through probably chapter 35, Isaiah is offering rebuke. And why is he rebuking the children of Israel? Because they don't want to trust God and they don't want to follow his ways. They are under a threat of Assyrian attack. The Assyrians are trying to come down from the north and attack the kingdoms of Israel, and they're still very stubborn and strong-willed, and the Bible actually refers to them as drunken people, drunken men, and I guess women, but drunken men, which is very significant. So another thing to point out is that the book of Isaiah has both figurative and literal language in it. It has both, and I'm going to highlight for you a little later on where the figurative language applies, but the literal language also applies throughout the text, because Isaiah is basically condemning, and by the word of the Lord, as he's led of the Lord, the actions of the Israelites who refused to put their trust in God. So while under the Assyrian threat, they're trying to set up an alliance with Egyptians to help defend them. And this was typically done during ancient times. They typically set up alliances with other nations, but Yahweh didn't want that. Yahweh was always their protector, and when they trust and were obedient to Yahweh, they won the wars, basically. But when they were not, of course, they lost. And Yahweh is basically showing them, the God of Israel, that their sole reliability, trust, and dependence has to be upon him and no one else. And there's a lot of history in this text, but I'm not going to go through all of it. But just for the sake of our Oil for the Journey oil change, 2 things to point out. Number one, when Isaiah was speaking to the children of Israel, again, it was a warning for them to trust God. What was interesting and popped out in chapter 28, verses, I would say 9 through 11, was that the leaders, remember, this was a rebuke of the leaders of Ephraim, one of the tribes of Israel that was in the northern kingdom. And Isaiah pointed out, who are you trying to teach in verse 9? And are you trying to teach a little child, giving them a rule for this, a rule for that, do this, do that? And that's essentially what the leaders of Israel took God's law down to, because they were self-indulgent. And when you see drunkenness in the Bible, it's usually because you're indulging in your lusts, your own desires. And so that's figurative, but it could be literal as well, because I'm sure they got drunk. But they were indulging in these sins, and so they boiled down the law of the Lord to just do's and don'ts. kind of like a parent would with a child. Remember, if a parent is raising a young child, they can't really rationalize with that child and explain to them why they shouldn't touch a hot stove or go near to the stove or turn on the fire on the stove. They just tell them don't do it. And that's what the leaders, the Israelite leaders, did, because they had the heart of God was not in them. They were indulging in their own lustful desires instead of trusting in the Lord. And the other thing, number 2, that I wanted to point out, which is the figurative, is that there was always hope. So although Isaiah was rebuking them for their selfish ways and their sinful ways, he was also providing hope. And a little bit of that appears in chapter 30. And basically, he was telling them, if you trust in me, then I, Yahweh, will protect you from the Assyrians. And I will allow your crops to grow, as I've always done. And I will basically lead you out of oppression, because they were being oppressed by their enemies as well. So it's important to note, and a lot of figurative language is used here, that in chapter 30, that there was hope provided, as our faithful Yahweh always does. Even when we're disobedient, he provides judgment because he's a just God, but hope as well. Hope that if you hear him and you answer to his call, if you trust in him, he will make the sins disperse from your life, and he will even cause goodness, blessings to come upon your life as a result. Now, of course, it's not as black and white, because you will go through trials, and even Isaiah points that out. But even through the trials, he is with you. He is who you should depend on. So, take away to know that although we go through adversity in this life, put your trust in the Lord and not in anyone or anything else. May God bless you.